It has been a long journey of cynicism and overall grumpiness, but we have finally made it to part 3 of the worst characters in every Nancy Drew game. I'm assuming that you've watched the first 2 parts if you're watching this, but if you've managed to stumble across this video by some strange twist of fate, I'll have both of the previous parts linked in the card thingamajigs up above, so be sure to check those out and come back later. We do things in order around here. Now that we've weeded out those people who like to read the last chapter first, let's get started. The same rules apply as in the last 2 segments. The character has to actually appear in the game, meaning no phone characters, and they have to have at least a few voice lines, meaning no characters like Fongo from the Phantom of Venice, but I don't think we have any more of those in these games anyway. Like before, this video will also include massive spoilers, including a few culprit reveals, so if I get to a game you haven't played, go use up one of those handy free Big Fish codes, and come back when you're done. Anyway, let's get going with number 23. Shadow at the Water's Edge traumatized me at a young age, but even my terrified 9-year-old self had to admit that most of the characters in the game were extremely deep and interesting compared to many others we had seen so far in the franchise. The least likable of these characters for me, though, had to be Yumi. This isn't saying that Yumi is poorly written. In fact, that may be one of the reasons why I dislike her so much. She acts just like the type of person that drives me nuts in real life. While she seems fun, she causes way too many problems for Nancy, and I'm not even sure how she's managed to last this long without being robbed or murdered or something. If I recall correctly, she gives us the key to her apartment after the first time we talk to her. That's not trusting, that's just very bad decision making. The biggest annoyance to me, though, is her total disregard for any of Nancy's wishes. She's that overbearing friend that forces you into things you don't want to do, but you end up doing them anyway because you aren't quite sure how to say no. Her most annoying moment is easily when she forces you to miss your train back to the Ryukon and pretty much makes you stay the night in her apartment. If it was me in Nancy's place, I'd be terrified that I was going to get mugged. That just doesn't seem okay to me. It all seems fishy. The Captive Curse is one of those games that people don't seem to like nearly as much as I do. I personally think that the writing in this game is some of the best in the series, with the characters being hilarious and thoughtful at the same time. I've heard a lot of people complain about the fact that we never find out what happened to the girls who were kidnapped years ago, and while I think that it adds a greater sense of mystery and some real depth to the fear that the characters felt when they heard that the monster had returned, I agree that it really does create a plot hole of sorts. That mystery could have been explored a lot farther than it was with a different culprit. The culprit in this game was very disappointing to me. I like that the game let you guess who the culprit was at the end, but I feel like they only did that because almost nobody would pick Anya the first time around. Her motivations just seem very weak compared to all the other characters. We could have gotten a deep, thoughtful story about Renata's past and her history with the monster, but instead all we got was a jealous ex-girlfriend. I'm not saying that I wanted Renata to be the villain. I don't know who I wanted to be the villain, just anybody but Anya. This game had the potential for one of the best culprit reveals in the game, and the end result is so disappointing that it automatically shoots Anya to the bottom of the character list this game offers. This one is pushing my rules a little bit, but I'm just gonna do it anyway. I think that Chief McGinnis is the worst character in Alibi and Ashes. If I had to go with a second, I'd probably say Brenda or maybe Tony, but I'm not picking a second, so we don't really have to worry about that unless you don't think that McGinnis counts as a character. Yes, I know that he only has a few lines of dialogue and isn't considered a suspect at any point in the story. He makes a ton of sense as a plot device, and he's an integral part of the majority of the game, even if we don't see or hear from him that much. One thing forces me to overlook all of this, though. The amount of times that I've heard him say that I don't have enough evidence over and over and over again is maddening. If I ever go completely certifiably nuts, it may very well be this guy's fault. Yes, I'm very biased, and yes, I'm probably overdoing it, but I got stuck on one of my first playthroughs of this game, and I had to call him in so many times that I started to genuinely hate the sound of his voice. Take my opinion as you will, though. Maybe I'll get over it in a few decades and change my mind. Tomb of the Lost Queen really isn't known for its characters a whole lot since it's extremely puzzle-based, and most of them, other than a nice phone call or two from everybody's favorite professor, aren't very memorable at all, at least for me anyway. I don't think that anybody will argue with me, though, when I say that Lily is the worst character, and maybe even one of the worst in the entire series. It's pretty bad when a character's most memorable quality is how bossy they are, and I have to say, Lily is excellent at being bossy. That might be the only thing she's excellent at, though. Her ambition, which serves as a decent enough motive, often just gets in the way of Nancy, and not in a very tolerable way either. Her constant squabbling with every other character also leads to most of the problems in the game, and I think that everybody would have honestly been happy if she was the culprit and we could just get rid of her as fast as possible. I'll be honest, I don't like the deadly device at all. I know that a ton of people like it, but I just don't see much of the appeal. I probably pay too much attention to story, and I just can't get past the massive plot holes at the ending, or how bland the setting gets after a little while. Despite that, this game does have some amazing characters, the best of which easily has to be Gray. Fun fact for all you fellow Star Wars people out there, Gray's voice actor also happens to be the same guy who voiced Salacious Crumb, the little monkey-looking thing in Jabba's palace that appears in Return of the Jedi. I'm not here to talk about the best characters though, so enough about him and more about Ellie. She's not necessarily bad, and I'm sure she's got her fans out there, but to me she was just the least memorable of the bunch. Gray is the fun grouch, Mason is so OCD to the point that even I think he's gone a bit off the deep end. Victor is an excellent villain, and Ryan has her gummy bears. It took me forever to try to remember Ellie's name when I was coming up with my list for this video because I just couldn't remember who she was. She acts as a decent character to bump up the number of suspects, but beyond that, she just feels a little bit filler to me. Ghost of Thornton Hall is another one of those games that I really grew to respect and enjoy over time. This is mostly due to the fact that I really began to understand some of the characters as I got older. Whether or not you enjoy the game's puzzles or atmosphere, it's hard not to feel at least a little bit of sympathy for some of the characters. Their stories are so sad and so mysterious at the same time. There are even still a few characters that I have yet to decipher despite the fact that I've played the game multiple times at this point. The complexity of most of those characters is also the reason why I sadly have to pick Wade as the worst character in the game. A lot of people like Wade's character, and I do too to an extent, but next to the other very well fleshed out characters that inhabit the island, he just feels not as important as the others. It's possible that some of his story was cut by the developers due to time restraints, but as is, Wade feels a little bit too much like the generic stereotypical creepy guy that likes to hang out in graveyards. Just for the aesthetic or something, I don't know. Kind of like the Phantom of Venice, the Silent Spy has a very different feel and layout from the other games in the franchise, and while most of the game's characters were interesting, even though they needed much more fleshing out, one of the worst offenders of bad culprit reveals comes from this game. Alex starts off as a semi-interesting character, feeding you some information but not enough to make things easy for you in standard Nancy Drew game fashion, but his character soon seems to just drop out of the game for a good long while. Maybe he needed a break from Glasgow and all of his plotting for a bit. Maybe he stopped off at Loch Lomond for a nice getaway, I don't know. No matter what he was doing while we were spying, when he finally becomes important again, it's just to explain that he was the culprit and that he had done a bunch of stuff that, until his confession, I hadn't even realized was the main mystery. The worst part of it all is when we question his motives, he just says, "Because I can." The silent spy committed the cardinal sin of crafting a villain. There has to be at least a little bit of motivation, and there just wasn't any at all. Also, I don't think we ever get to find out exactly what happened to Kate, which was supposed to be the entire point of the game in the first place. That bugs me a little bit too much too. The Shattered Medallion is yet another game in the series that almost nobody seems to enjoy, and unsurprisingly, neither do I. At first, I instantly chose Kiri as the worst character in this game because at face value, she is probably the worst villain we've ever had in a Nancy Drew game. Recently, however, I read a Reddit post that changed my entire understanding of the game. I'll attempt to find it and link it down in the description if anybody wants to read it. I highly recommend you do. Taking my new appreciation for the game and some of its characters into account, however small it may be, I have to choose Lena as the worst character instead. Even though she might not be the first bad character that came to my mind, she serves no purpose at all in the game. At least Patrick was a decent bit of comic relief, and Sunny was, well, Sunny. Lena had very little to do with anything in the game, and we don't even get any backstory for her. The Shattered Medallion feels very much like a game that was rushed through development, and Lena might be the very worst victim of it. Labyrinth of Lies is a pretty weird game because of its strange setting and very unusual ending for the series. And unfortunately, the characters are less mysterious in figuring out how I thought that was how you spell labyrinth. Seriously, you should see it. I have no idea how to even pronounce that. The most mysterious character of them all, though, actually ends up being the worst. It seems like Thanos was attempting to make up for his fellow actors' lack of mysteriosity, I don't think that's a word, by being overly mysterious, to the point that it's even a mystery where to find him, or why he likes to intimidate everybody, or why he growls like that. Seriously, it's not intimidating, it's just weird, stop it. Or why he's even included in the game at all. Sea of Darkness is an amazing game that was just unfortunate enough to be wedged in between some of the worst games that Her Interactive has ever released. Come to think of it, that might be the reason why we think it's so good after all. Either way, the writing team also delivered on all accounts. Many of the characters in this game are extremely heartfelt and interesting, and then there's also Dagny. Dagny is mostly on this list just because I don't understand her. Yes, I get the whole I work alone thing, but some of her decision making completely perplexes me. The main issue is that she asks, or I guess Moira asks for her, but it's close enough. She asks Nancy to come help her find Magnus, but immediately refuses to help her any time she asks for the littlest thing. Her strange decision to fake her own kidnapping/murder is also pretty weird considering she shows up in the same exact spot only about a day or two later. I don't think that anyone in the town would have even noticed that she was gone for that little bit, no matter how small of a place it is. I also don't understand why she implicated Gunnar in her kidnapping. Not sure if it was intentional or not, but I hope that it wasn't because he didn't do anything to her aside from his normal hollering and yelling and scaring everyone off for the fun of it. I just don't get her. Compared to all of the other characters in this game, she just feels pretty shallow. And oh boy, we made it. The game that we have almost all completely agreed that we just don't talk about. I had to reinstall this game and play it again, at least partially for this video, and I hope you guys appreciate that. In case we're wondering, I still don't like it. I might play it in a couple years just so I have another excuse to complain about it. Either way, I couldn't pick the worst character in this game, not because they were all good or at the very least all tolerable. This time I struggled because they were all bad. I eventually landed on Judge Danforth because his introduction was the exact moment in the game that my brain just stopped caring. Yes, that early. Sure, I still finished it, but I got nothing much out of it at all because I was still processing the fact that the judge had managed to lock himself in his office. These people elected this man. I've heard a lot of people say that it's because he lives in a small town and has connections, but I live in a small town, and we wouldn't elect this bozo no matter how many connections he had. I feel the need to also mention that when I asked the Nancy Drew subreddit a little while back, a lot of people mentioned that they hated Alicia's character because of her weird obsession with Jason, which I admit was very weird. I agree with that, and she could be the worst character. I'm just speaking from my own personal experience. Judge Danforth just drove me completely nuts. Anyway, we finally made it. I have named the worst character in every single Nancy Drew game. It has certainly been interesting, if not the most cheerful of subjects, and I'd love to make more videos like this in the future. If you have any suggestions, or if I missed a character that you especially disliked, be sure to let me know down in the comments. As always, a like is always appreciated, and if you'd like to subscribe or share these videos with another fan, it'd mean a whole lot to me. Hopefully you enjoyed this one, and I hope that I'll see you in the next one. Thanks!